Hello, my name is Jeffrey Boakye and welcome to my Teachit Talks on exploring core values in curriculum design. We're going to get straight into it with a question that will immediately ask you to exercise your opinion. Which is the best cup? All right. Now, the minute I ask you that, your brain starts doing all sorts of somersaults to try to work out which cup is best for you based on whichever value judgments you've put into place for the purposes that you need a cup for. So if it's something to hold really hot liquid, you might go for the mug because it's got a handle, you're not going to hurt yourself. If it's something to cater for a large number of people and to hold small amounts of water, you might go for the plastic cup and so on. If you want something that might be worth a lot of money in the future, that's better for the environment, you might go for the wooden cup. Now, what's happening in this process is you're becoming a designer just by thinking about what you value, what you need, what you want. And this is the start of the conversation, really, because the curriculum can operate in the same way. There's something about the curriculum which is a design conversation, really. And design always starts with an element of what problem do you want to solve? What do you want to achieve? And what do you need? If we go back to the national curriculum, right, to the birth of the national curriculum in 1988, then we have to take a step back even further to Victorian England. This is Matthew Arnold, and his words, he was a poet and a critic of the Victorian era, and his words are echoed in the language of the national curriculum, which stands to this day. There's something he said about the best that has been thought and said, and essential knowledge is also part of the design principles of the modern national curriculum in this country. But you have to start thinking about what was the vision for this curriculum in the first place? What was it trying to achieve? At this point in time, really, it was always about offering opportunities to be honest, the sons of like middle class families. It was about offering routes into professional careers, the types of jobs that the aspiring middle and upper middle classes would be reaching for. Because of that, there's an element of professionalism to the national curriculum. There's also this thing about qualifications and therefore assessment, which kind of dictates the rhythms of the curriculum to this day. Now, you can see that in all of that, what the curriculum has ended up looking like is very much tied to the context that it was born in the first place. There are some values at play which have kind of dictated what we've ended up with, and we're still dealing with it today. Now, if we go a little bit deeper, we get into ideology, because the national curriculum isn't born in a vacuum. There are ideological things at play. We're talking about Britain, we're talking about an empire, we're talking about, the white Western world. We're talking about a whole narrative which focuses on a particular mindset, really, and a particular story that's been told over time. Here's a recent Google search of mine, Scientists from History. It's interesting because this snapshot, as of the 21st century, tells a story. It says that, first of all, right now, the algorithm is kind of doing a bit of a gender balance. You can see there are men and women represented in famous scientists from our shared history. Look a bit deeper and you notice that the majority of these faces are what you'd call, white and European. So that in itself tells a story. It says that science is the preserve of white Europe, which is obviously not true, because scientists come from every continent throughout history. And actually, the contributions to science and thinking and intellectualism are pan-global. But we can see here how ideology can sit right in the design of our thinking. It can be a construct that shapes what happens as we go forward. And this is something which is important to recognize, but we can tackle it practically too. Now, one of the things which we need to start thinking about with the design of a curriculum, right, are what are you trying to solve problem-wise? Where are the problems? If you go back to the cups, the problems you're trying to solve will eventually design the cup for you. If you need something which is, smooth to the touch and doesn't conduct heat, then you're going to choose a particular material. If you want it to be cheaply mass produced, it's going to be another material, and so on and so forth. Now, I think there are some problems that the world is facing, has faced, and will continue to face, that can really be embedded into the design principles of our shared curriculum. A huge area is social justice. A term that was coined in the 18th century, around the time when Britain was going through its industrial revolution, and therefore you had a lot of social injustice, a lot of inequality, kind of hierarchies based on socioeconomics, based on class and status. So social justice is trying to reach equity and potentially even equality, because it sees that the world is not fair. That is a problem that the curriculum could be an intervention in. Geopolitics, a huge area. Geopolitics is essentially the movement of peoples around the world, the overlapping of geography and politics. It accounts for migration patterns, immigration, asylum seeking, refugees. We see the world change quite rapidly because of geopolitical trends and movements. Identity politics is a huge area which I spend a lot of time thinking about. Our protected characteristics, the things that make us who we are, that need to be handled with respect and care. You know, our race, our gender, our socioeconomic background, our disability status, and so on and so forth. These are things that can lead you to have a very strong argument about the way the world is working or isn't working. And finally, you can just about see it there, sustainability. Sustainability, can we meet the needs of the future without compromising the present? Can we meet the needs of the present without compromising the future? Now, if you have a strong argument in these areas, then you are going to make certain decisions about how the world is going to be shaped. And I believe that the curriculum, the taught curriculum, can be an intervention in these areas, obviously. But let me show you two pictures of bridges. Now, segue. The bridge on the left is the Tahoma Narrows Bridge. It's in America somewhere, or it was a long time ago. It's a black and white picture. It was a very, very successful, initially, suspension bridge spanning a large distance. Problem is that it was very, very rigid. It was very strong. Now, when the wind hit this bridge, all of that energy from the wind had nowhere to go, and the bridge started to tremble. And that trembling kind of escalated, and it started to kind of wave and gallop. Local journalists called it Galloping Gertie. It was very exciting. And in Galloping Gertie one day just broke apart. And it broke apart in dramatic fashion because of the tension caused by wind. If you look at the bridge on the right, that's the Humber Bridge, which is near where I live in East Yorkshire. And the Humber Bridge is about as old as I am, and it's still standing. At one point, it was the longest single span suspension bridge on the planet. Now, unlike the Tahoma Narrows Bridge, the Humber Bridge actually welcomes the tension that is caused by strong winds. It's designed so that the wind goes under the road deck and it kind of lifts the bridge up. So it actually gains strength from the wind that might threaten to take it apart. It also sways in the wind. It can sway up to 6 feet under heavy winds, which is pretty impressive for a massive suspension bridge. And there are points in the bridge where there are joins, and these joins flex and bend to give the bridge flexibility when the weather gets rough. Now, the metaphor is an obvious one, all right? The metaphor is really simple. It's that you need to build flexibility into your structures to make them strong. Trying to build your structures strong actually does the opposite and ironically makes them weaker. Our curriculum is just like this, because the Victorian mindset that Matthew Arnold was kind of born in, that the curriculum was conceived in, is all about batch production, uniformity, strength, rigidity, and kind of power. But we know that one size doesn't fit all. In fact, it's the opposite. One size fits none. Let's go back a bit to, must have been at 2013, maybe 2014. I was doing some CPD at a school, and one of my colleagues, a drama teacher, introduced me to this poem by Khalil Gibran. And the poem has a central metaphor that children are not our children, they are arrows, and we are archers who have to fire these arrows into the future. And then the idea is that we need to think hard about how we fire these arrows and the bows that we craft. I like this metaphor because when I presented it to the teachers who were in my CPD sessions, it got us thinking hard about how we fire our arrows. And you can see from this picture here, taken from the CPD session, there was lots to be said about the way we shape the curriculum, what makes us good archers or not. You know, the strength of the archer, the ability of the archer, distractions, is the target moving, the weather. We went back to things like, you know, the wind, and we landed on this idea of gravity. You know, gravity being a force that ultimately means the arrows are going to hit the ground. There are many, many ideological constructs like that in our world. Big ideas like, you know, race, gender, class, constructs that are so pervasive that they are real and they pin us to our seat. Now, I'm showing you this because when we went further, I started to see that there were very, very powerful values at play in teachers' perception of their jobs. It wasn't just an intellectual exercise, right? And this talk here is about core values and curriculum design. I asked the teachers to write just a couple of sentences to summarize their feelings about this. And all I did was cut and paste them into one document here. And it's incredibly powerful. If we had time, I'd read the whole thing out to you. But what I saw was a manifesto. So I called it a manifesto about how the curriculum can transcend context, how it can allow young people to grow upwards away from the things that try to root them to the spot, you know, be transformative, how it can embrace flexibility. And then we put it into practice. We thought about a student, a real student, who was struggling to fit in with the school community, who was struggling to thrive in the one size fits all, one size fits none curriculum that we were offering. And two different groups had to think about what they could do if they were designing a curriculum for just that student. And you'll see the word flexible keeps on coming up. You know, it's written down a few times. There's lots of things about what that particular child needs. And the bespoke mindset completely changes the way we think about design, because actually you don't have to just make something for one person. You can make something flexible enough to accommodate lots of different lived experience and lots of different identities. And that is a design principle in itself. And it's very energizing because it makes the design cleverer, it makes it better, and it makes it more human. So we're already thinking hard now about how the curriculum can be an intervention towards something that works more for the vast array of individuals that end up in the education system. But what about you? What about us? What about the teachers and educators? A question I keep getting asked as someone that writes about education, the curriculum, someone that writes about literature in the curriculum. I keep getting asked, what should the canon be? And I think it's a trick question. I think people are trying to catch me out, because I don't believe that you should get rid of one canon and replace it with another. It's like getting rid of one very rigid bridge and replacing it with another very rigid bridge. I actually think that the canon is something which can live and breathe in educators, and it's entirely flexible. What you're looking at now is a selection of texts, and I mean that in the truest sense of the word, that I have used at different points in my teaching career to do different things with different groups of students. And it ranges from everything from novels, as you might expect, to very difficult non-fiction texts for adults, to picture books for very young children, to contemporary movies and cinema, to pieces of music or stage plays, and everything in between. I've even got sporting events, which I've used as a text with which to explore certain ideas. I'm showing you this because actually the canon is something which I find lives in me. You can see my identity, you can see my lived experiences, my argument with the world in the choices that I've made. And the flexibility and the agility required is something that makes the design ultimately more alive and makes it able to speak to context in a more direct way, rather than choosing the same thing and saying that's the best that's been thought and said and forever it shall be. Now, decolonizing is a term which gets thrown at me a lot. People actually ask me, like, how do you do it? How do you decolonize the curriculum? And I'm going to level with you. You can't. You know, colonization as something that's happened in our shared human story is baked into the narrative. And to decolonize is like asking someone to unbake a cake into its component parts. You just can't do it. You know, the eggs, flour and sugar has been transformed into something else. We've got white supremacy, the sexist patriarchy, we've got classism baked into society. What you can do, though, is recognize that fact and recognize, as in re-understand what you're looking at. 3 recent examples. my littlest kid, 5 years old, he's at school doing lots of number work. And it got me thinking, because he was doing like 1 to 10. And I was thinking about the concept of zero, which is something which has a fascinating history. The concept of zero has been invented like 3 times in human history. The first time was in Babylon about 2,300 years ago. And it was just a placeholder at that point. It wasn't really a mathematical thing. Then you go to India in the 7th century and you get the concept of shunya from the astronomer Brahmagupta. And Brahmagupta had this idea that zero as a concept can help us to understand maths. That's transformative. That changes the game. Then you move to Baghdad in the 9th century and zero is sort of rediscovered. It's not until, thousands of years later in the Middle Ages that Europe gets hold of the concept of zero. And that's when it enters into this particular part of the world, into this grand narrative. That's interesting to me because that's not about finding a new narrative. It's just about recognizing what has already existed but has been marginalized. My eldest son comes home, he's doing the Romans. For about 2 weeks, it's Romans, Romans, Romans. He learns everything about the Romans. And I start thinking, but I wonder if he and his classmates know about why the Roman Empire never quite made it into the African continent. Well, it's because of Queen Amanirenas, the warrior queen of the Kush Empire, who over a number of years fought back against the Roman Empire successfully. She was a one-eyed warrior queen, a very, very large and life figure from history. But that's an Afrocentric way of looking at the world. So if you don't have that underlying principle of having a breadth of narrative and respecting all of the contributions, then your curriculum will end up being brittle, rigid, and actually quite limited. And when the winds of change hit it, it's going to fall apart. I got on to then talking to my sons about the Moors, these group of traveling intellectuals who would have brought knowledge from Asia through Africa all the way up to southern Spain and therefore to Europe, bringing a number of inventions and factors of civilization that Europe had never seen, including the idea of like universal literacy and like libraries. Again, because of the white supremacist design principle that's in our society and therefore in our curriculum, the Moors are not common knowledge to school-age people or to many school-educated adults. Now, in all of this, there's a very important triangle, the strongest shape in the world, consisting of the student, the teacher, and the text. I've alluded to this, but we can break this down more. The same drama teacher that introduced me to the Khalil Gibran poem introduced me to this concept here. And I think it's quite powerful because there's a relationship between these 3 elements, which has to be taken very seriously in order to live out a curriculum which does the job it's supposed to do. And around all 3 of these elements, you get context. What's happening around the student, the teacher, and the text which you are exploring, the ideas which you are navigating. We can put this into practice, right? Let's go back to like 2012 or so. I'm an English teacher. I'm teaching the poems of William Blake. There's a copyright-free image of William Blake, one of the Romantic poets who comes up time and time again in the English secondary curriculum. Great, but who is William Blake to me? What's my argument with William Blake? What's my way in? Those 2 images there represent me. They're 2 books that I've written. As a black person, as a black man, as a geriatric millennial, as someone with an interest in music and outsider art, I can see things in William Blake's work which I then start to overlay with other artists who are not on the curriculum. Boy in the Corner by Dizzy Rascal. That was a very, very clear link for me because Dizzy Rascal was a young rapper from East London who did the same thing as William Blake just 300 years later, being critical of society, being an outsider artist, saying complicated things in very simple, accessible language, breaking a lot of rules of language whilst doing so, being playful, being energetic, being provocative. So to me, it was a no-brainer to bring Dizzy Rascal's work into the curriculum. And then we start thinking about the link between the student and myself. I'm a Londoner. My students, they're in London too. We share that Same with William Blake and Dizzy Rascal. So it makes sense to think about that. And recently in London, just a year before the school had actually opened, there had been riots in London. To ignore that context, I think I would have been remiss to ignore that context, because this is a lived experience that these young people had been through, as had I. At the time, Boris Johnson was mayor of London. His name would come up in rap lyrics, people talking about Boris. And a lot of the kids knew who he was, but didn't know who he really was. So as someone with a little bit of extra knowledge, I could introduce them to the Bullingdon Club, Oxford University in 1987, which just happened to contain in its members a number of future prime ministers and high-ranking government officials. So we're talking about power, we're talking about social justice, we're talking about identity, we're talking about all the things which I want to talk about and which I feel are important. And then that takes us back to these broader issues of power that we can discuss in the British Empire. Now, what I'm trying to demonstrate here is that your lived experience, your perspective on the world is a vital piece of the puzzle. It's part of the design of the curriculum. The curriculum lives in you as a teacher as much as it lives in the texts which you teach and the students who are on that learning journey with you. Now, I was recently lecturing some PGC students, primary PGC students, and I threw this at them as a provocation because they're brand new teachers, and I wanted them to start thinking about how they can design the learning journey rather than just be kind of like passive recipients of the best that has been thought and said. And the first thing I asked is the same question I'll ask you now. What's your way into the text? What's your argument? When you're presented with a topic, with a subject, with a specialism, what is your particular insight that allows you to start venturing into that? And then at the same time, what might your young people, your children, your students be experiencing that might connect with that topic? Because it might be different things. And actually, that curiosity is something which will open up the doors of opportunity and make the curriculum even more flexible, because you're starting to factor in things that you don't know. And then finally, what's happening contextually around all of you that you can leverage as a way in? At any given point in history, there's stuff kicking off that probably hasn't happened before, or stuff which everyone is grappling with. We've lived through a pandemic. There are a lot of there are conflicts, geopolitical conflicts that weren't happening when I was at school that are happening now. There are conversations surrounding identity and gender that are kind of new to the world, or there are newer nuances too. So can you leverage that? Now, obviously, the issue arises when you just don't care about the text. That happens. A lot of these primary school teachers were just teaching random stuff that they didn't really have a stake in. One student in particular, she just wasn't into maths, and she just wasn't that fussed. So she had no burning fire as to how to teach maths. So I went through the gears and I was trying to work out, how do you feel about maths? Is there beauty in maths? What about music and maths? Like, do you like that kind of thing? And then we stumbled across the idea of problem solving. And that was interesting because problem solving was something that did kind of make a light bulb, flicker above her head. And we got to this idea of maybe you could present a series of problems to your students and then see if there are mathematical solutions. Now that to me was quite an exciting moment of creation. It was the curriculum coming alive in ways that were unforeseeable, and it was all linked to the belief that if you tap into your creative energy and to your value judgments, then you're going to end up with something that's vital and probably a better fit than just trying to do something generic. You would have seen on an earlier slide that Groundhog Day is one of the texts that I've used or taught, and yeah, the best that has been thought and said. It's one of the greatest films of all time. Bill Murray working out how to live forever in order to eventually fall in love with Andy McDowell. Perfect. I've used this text to kind of explore well-being, coaching, all sorts of kind of like development personal development issues, and it's powerful. And there's a book called The Wisdom of Groundhog Day, which offered two distinctions that I think are quite useful for us to summarize some of this conversation. The first is this thing called the conditioned self. The conditioned self. It's an idea that society is conditioning us in certain ways, and that's preventing us from really flourishing. You'll see yourself in this list. That last one says dependency. Schools often kind of create individuals who are conditioned to feel entitled or seek approval. Social media does that. You're always seeking approval, looking for likes and looking for people connecting with you. And that's insecurity too, because you can't just exist in yourself, or trying to be in control of things, or being dependent, not realizing that you can flourish in your own steam. Something in education does this to young people and therefore to adults. The flip side is way more positive, the actualized self. This is what I think the curriculum education in general needs to be reaching towards. People who are resilient. I'm not a big fan of praising resilience, you should be tough. But at the same time, learning is all about resilience, because you're presented with things you can't do, knowledge that you don't have, and you have to work your way through it in order to have some level of mastery over it and be empowered. So that in itself is a design principle in education. We're invited to be resilient and resourceful. When you think about a lot of pedagogies like project-based learning, it's all about resourcefulness, problem solving, reaching into your toolkit to work out what you need to do to go forward. And that requires agility. Moving between spaces, not staying in one place, being flexible within yourself to know that tomorrow's lesson might feel different to yesterday's lesson because things might have changed, or you might have moved on, or the context might have changed, to go back to that triangle. And in all of this is a big design principle for me personally, right? This is me now. I feel like curiosity is fundamental, because seeking out answers and definite answers is a path towards becoming brittle and rigid, just like Galloping Gertie, the bridge that fell apart. Curiosity is all about flexibility. It's about welcoming new. It's about looking into blind spots. It's about seeing things you don't know and actively seeking out those areas of, those areas of shadow to illuminate them. And that forces you to be experimental, which is energizing. And actually, it always leads to better design, because inventions, when you think about that, they are inventive, they're experimental, and they often change the world. And finally, well-being. Well-being is something that we have in us. You just need to find those contexts and situations that will allow you to flourish into your well-being. And that's something which education sometimes doesn't focus on, particularly when you go back to the design principle of get qualifications in order to become a professional, in order to do certain jobs that are respected by certain classes of people. Well-being doesn't come into that conversation a lot of the time. Money does, security does, but well-being, not often, right? So hopefully, because we're going to wrap up now, I should say thank you actually, because I always forget that part. Thank you for listening, because, your time and your energy is everything. But hopefully some of that has been insightful and kind of just a useful way of thinking about curriculum as a design principle for a type of learning which isn't fixed and solid, and therefore likely to fall apart when buffeted by the winds of idiosyncrasy, which is a long way of saying, get ready to be curious. Right. My name's Jeffrey Boakye. That was my Teachit Talk on Groundhog Day and curriculum design, and core values. And yeah, let's say until next time. Until next time.